Good afternoon, FCA members. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is John Lee, your FCA Director of Operations. It is truly my pleasure to introduce our esteemed Director of Legislative Affairs, Mike Oscar, and our Government Committee co-chairs, Bernie Gingras, Executive Director of the New Jersey Glass and Metal Contractors Association, and Ken Ober, owner of Elite Painting out of Illinois. With Mike's extensive experience in government relations and a deep understanding of the legislative landscape, along with our co-chairman's efforts throughout the years, this team has been instrumental in shaping our legislative strategies and advocating for your interests on Capitol Hill. Today, we'll be discussing the recent election results and their implications on our government relations activities, committee activities, and our future fly-in. We are truly fortunate to have such a knowledgeable and dedicated team guiding us through these complex times. And with that, take it away, Mike.
Okay. Can you hear me all right, John?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very, very much. We've been monitoring very closely, not only from the committee level, but also as a board and then as members to determine how the outcome of this 2024 election resulted. And I think we're at least in good shape to know that it's under one-party control, and that it's a trifecta within the Republicans taking over the House, the Senate, and the White House. I'm happy to see that we have a decisive, not divisive, but decisive count on who actually won. Actually, John and I debated this along with Bernie and Ken when to actually hold this meeting, because we thought last week would be too soon. So coming into this week, at least we have some clarity. So yes, going into the elections, the Democrats held one seat in majority in the Senate. 34 seats were up for election, including a special election in Nebraska. Democrats or independents who caucus with Democrats held 23 of those at-play seats. The Republicans have won control in the Senate. Currently, right now, the vote is 54-46 with the Senate majority. And then with the House, we have about 218, still 6 outstanding seats. But let's move forward a little bit. Can you see that all right? I'm changing the slides. Good. So on the presidential election, I think the one thing that going into this, looking at the results of 2016 and in 2020 and now in 24, but looking back in 2016 and in 2020, and for those of you who may or may not be aware of my background, I've been working with FCA International for almost 12, going on 13 years. But in total, 24 years in the industry of looking at legislation, the political spectrum, and the regulatory side. Going into this election and talking to friends of mine that work as pollsters, both on the Republican and Democratic side, we saw in 2016 and 2020 that Trump was basically within favorability within his own party, give or take 47-48%. And there have been reports about this, not only in the newspapers, but on blogs and even commentary that's been offered that Democrats, that is even Joe Biden and then Vice President Harris, based a campaign off of that. But what we saw based upon the results, not only in the Electoral College, but more specifically in the popular vote, he exceeded 48-49%, closer to 50-51%. And one of the ways he was able to do that was because he was able to take away votes from other candidates. For example, RFK Jr. stepped down for his election in order to join President Trump's election. And when you have a very close election where ultimately 45% of the vote is guaranteed to Trump and 45% of the vote was guaranteed to Biden and then eventually Harris, you're really dealing with that 10%. To get up to 100, and that 10%, if you got RFK or if you have Jill Stein, that's all taking votes away. And so by eliminating RFK, that was a win for him, getting additional votes. And we knew going in that the Electoral College, and I'll go to the next slide, was going to be important to him because in these battleground states, which he won not only in the popular vote, but he won an electoral vote, we knew he had to get to 270. And he got to 270, and he actually exceeded it by getting close to 312 votes. That was a surprise to some degree for those that were looking at it based upon the polling and based upon the state legislators, meaning that there are right now in control roughly 27 states that Republicans control the trifecta, the Senate, the House, and the governor's office. So in those states, when it comes to redistricting, we just had a redistricting back in 2020. In the census reports, then we were able to determine that it's likely he'll win the electoral vote, which candidly, came to play in 2016, in 2020. However, he did not win the popular vote. So the surprise was winning the popular vote. How did he win the popular vote? Well, there's many theories to that, but one theory that I think came true based upon some of the limited conversations I've had with you and with the committee and the board and just FCA international members was the economy. The economy drove this election. And no presidential candidate wants to run an election in an inflation, and they certainly don't want to run one in a recession. I ran a campaign back in 2006 during the beginning of the recession, and then one after in 2010, and it's not fun, for a lack of a better term. It's not something you really want to deal with. And the inflation concerns that were raised and what bringing down the interest rates by Jerome Powell up until the election, that's fine, but it was insignificant enough in terms of getting on people's minds that prices are still high. And they are coming down, but they're still elevated enough to get the average person's attention. The second thing that we saw that was in Trump's favor by bleeding into some of that 10%, I'll call that, the independents, we talked about the 45 and 45. So how do we get to that 10%? Well, you take a little bit of RFK off. You take a little bit of the Nikki Haley vote off, right? So now the Jill Stein vote. Well, the Jill Stein vote was bifurcated because the progressives, and this is documented, this is not me just saying it, but the progressives decided within the Democratic Party, due to the whole conflict in Israel and Palestine, Gaza, et cetera, they decided that they were not going to vote for Harris, certainly weren't going to vote for Trump, so they gave those votes to Jill Stein. But a vote for Stein, candidly, was a vote for Trump. So that was another avenue to which played in his favor. The third course of action that played in Trump's favor, and I ran, my background, I ran and worked for Senator Arlen Specter. He was a moderate Republican, and they're a dying breed right now. And we had worked in the Latino communities, Hispanic communities, African-American communities almost 10, 15 years ago. That was very uncommon for a Republican to do that. For Trump to go into those neighborhoods and into those environments, into those groups, like he did with the young men through his son and his son's influence, that is Barron Trump, what that did was it took votes away. It didn't take a significant amount of votes away. I want to be clear about that. It's not like he shot up 10 to 15 to 20% within the Hispanic Latino community, because a lot of people don't realize his comments about Puerto Rico at his Madison Square Garden presentation certainly upset the Puerto Rican members and Puerto Rican community, but it didn't necessarily impact the Cuban vote. It certainly didn't. One of the reasons why he wants Marco Rubio to be a Secretary of State was directly to that vote. So again, you just take a few of those votes, and all that does is draw down from Vice President Harris. What happened here in the swing states too? In order for Harris to succeed, she needed two things. She needed not only to match Biden's record in 2020, but she needed to exceed it. And that did not happen. It happened in spots, but not consistently. The second issue was women. And a lot of people anticipated, especially after the Roe decision, the recent Roe decision out of the Supreme Court. Well, that impacted in 2018, leading up to 2020, 2022, but we did not see that same reaction in 24 regarding abortion. It's not to say it's still not a number one issue. It is. But the reality is the enthusiasm for that issue did not necessarily parlay to Vice President Harris. So when you look at women, what I like to do is when I look at a poll, especially exit polls or even polls that are just out in the field, if they're plus or minus 3%, I look at the crosstabs. So when I look at crosstabs, I see exactly what people are thinking, what they're saying, how they're reacting. And what we saw with women is whether they were educated or whether they were not educated. And it wasn't an age thing, but the majority of women that you anticipated coming out for Vice President Harris did not happen. And it did not happen in the numbers that she needed it to happen. And so that gets to my final point. So what did happen? Well, I'll tell you, there's one thing that polls can never determine. And this is not a matter of polling's good or bad. It's just that you can never take away the privacy factor of a vote. And that is, I may say something publicly. I may not want to put a sign out for either candidate because I don't want to be labeled that way. I can tell you right now, I haven't put a political sign on my house ever. And I don't think I ever will, because for me, it depends on a lot of different things to make my decision. But the reality is that a lot of people may have said or done one thing, but when it came to voting, it became pretty clear that people were voting in Trump's direction. Finally, the impact of mail-in ballots was very, very helpful to both candidates, very helpful to Republican candidates, because remember, they were not big fans of mail-in ballots. I can remember working in Republican primaries for members of Congress, and the idea of sending a mail-in ballot in the early 2000s was sacrilege. Driving someone to the polls that wasn't a family member was sacrilege. That has changed. That has evolved. Here we are in 2024. That had a specific impact. I would say that moving forward, the one thing about the Senate that is still outstanding is the Casey race in Pennsylvania. Very close a race, 49.5 to 49.6, give or take. There were about 30,000 votes ahead for McCormick, but they did not meet the threshold of a 0.1 and a half. You have to meet a half a percentage of 1% in order not to have a recount. They did not meet that minimum. That was a requirement by state law. So they're doing a recount. There's 100,000 provisional and overseas ballots that need to be counted. They anticipate that they'll be counted by November 27th. So that's why right now in the Senate, it's 50. It's likely to be 54-46, but I would not, underestimate Bob Casey, son of the governor. He was on the general. He was attorney general. And Secretary of Treasury, excuse me, and then Senator. He's been in the Senate for the last 3 terms, 18 years. But that being said, that's still to be determined. Now, let's talk about Marco Rubio. So if it's 54-46, you lose Casey or you gain Casey and you don't win McCormick, now you're 53-47, but then you got the Marco Rubio seat, so that's 52-48, although likely the Republican governor from Florida will get that back to 53. So you're looking either 53-47 or 54-46. But when Thune was elected as majority leader, taking over for Mitch McConnell, held that position for 18 years, Thune said very clearly, I'm not getting rid of the filibuster. So that can also be of concern not only for the legislative process, because if you're 54-46 or 53-47, you still have to get to 60. So you have to bring over Democrats. And that's getting harder and harder to do if you're replacing these moderate Democrats with very conservative Republicans. And that's what happened with John Tester in Montana. John Tester was a good vote for us as FCA International because, we needed a moderate to understand that. Joe Manchin on dealing with permitting reform was a good vote for us, West Virginia, but now he didn't seek re-election. So Jim Justice won, the former governor of West Virginia. So you lose that Democrat. You had Sherrod Brown. Sherrod Brown should not be unfamiliar to anybody on this call, specifically Ken, John, and Tony, and Bernie, and many others that were involved in our multi-employer pension reform. Remember his guy, and we worked with him very closely because Brown was very specific on the Teamsters perspective and was not very open necessarily to the hybrid of a combined defined benefit plan and defined contribution plan. But the reality was he at least knew our issues, and unfortunately he lost. So getting those, what I'm getting at is getting those moderate Democrats to come and work together to get to that 60 is going to be challenging. Also, too, when Harry Reid was majority leader, working with Mitch McConnell, they lifted the threshold for judicial nominations. So that means any appointment onto the Supreme Court doesn't meet the filibuster. Similarly, could happen with judicial nominations at the lower courts. And that gets to what Trump's been talking about, recess appointments. And what that really means in recess appointments is, and that was a case that went to Supreme Court in 2014 that says that the Senate is out more than 10 days, more than a 10-day period. On the 11th day, the president has the right to do a recess nomination. And when would that occur? Well, that would occur, for example, like a month ago in October when they were out for 6 weeks. That's more than 10 days. They could have done a recess appointment. That's how you get a guy like RFK in. That's how you get a controversial candidate like a Matt Gaetz in. So again, coming up on the Christmas break, they're going to be gone for 2 weeks. Again, he's not in office yet, but that would be an opportunity. Next opportunity would be for him during the spring recess, the August recess. So those are the concerns about recess appointments. And he doesn't have, because I know some people are like, wow, Republicans control, it's the trifecta. This is great. Well, remember, we didn't get an infrastructure bill back in 2016 when Republicans controlled the Congress. We did get a Tax and Jobs Act passed, but we didn't get necessarily an infrastructure bill. That happened in the Biden administration. And that doesn't mean currently right now with all the Republicans of the 54, he's going to have them on board. He's going to have two moderates, Susan Collins from Maine, who will ultimately become the chair of the Appropriations Committee. Remember the power of the chair of the Appropriations Committee. Remember Bob Burr from West Virginia? Well, that's a pretty powerful position. She also controls the purse strings for the individual agencies and how they get funded. Lisa Murkowski, a very good vote for us on a lot of our issues when it comes to contract reform, is from Alaska. So that's another one. Then you have to question where McConnell is, because he's been fair to partly cloudy on President Trump. He'll still be in office. He has 2 more years to serve. So what's he going to do now that he's no longer in leadership? And, he has a little room to play, if you will, because he doesn't have to carry the team. Looking at Tillis from the Carolinas. He's also been one that hasn't been in lockstep with the party. Looking at, and I have a picture of my office with the lovely Penny McDonald and Senator Young. And Young did not work with the president. He voted for impeachment. He also was not very happy with what happened on January 6th. So that vote, how's that going to play out? You got a Joni Ernst, who's helping us right now in the House Small Business Committee with change order reform. She's another one that's not lockstep with Trump and the administration. So with those votes, how does that all play out for Trump? He's got to figure that out. I do think that if rumors are true that Laura Trump, Eric's wife, his daughter-in-law, would probably serve out the Republican seat for Rubio, that would be very telling as well, because if you remember during the Bush 2 years, Texas was the Mecca of the Republican Party. Well, Florida now is the Mecca of the Republican Party, and they have all their electoral votes went to Trump. So that was a big deal. He's gotten, and he knows it because he's got Matt Gaetz, now a former member, running for Attorney General. That's Florida. Then we've got the second one is Mike Wells, who's coming from Florida in this as a cabinet secretary. And then you got Marco Rubio that's leaving to become Secretary of State. So how does that all play out? Moving forward on the House side, you got Lee Stefanik from upstate New York. She's going to become the UN ambassador. So that's a seat he's got to fill in a special election. They're talking about G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania. He might fill the seat as USDA Secretary, Department of Agriculture. So, again, when you have such slim majorities right now, they're at 218. They've met the threshold, but it's like there's still 6 outstanding Republican seats that need to be considered. So that could get them to 224. In the last Congress, if you recall, they had 222. So he only had 4 votes. He's likely to look at 6 votes, but he knows in his own caucus, he's not going to get everybody on board. And a big issue when it comes to the tax Jobs and Tax Act, they still want to follow President Trump's promise to ensure they're not going to tax tips. Well, that's great, but that comes at a cost. Somehow you're going to have to make that up. And that additional cost to the overall federal deficit is not something the conservatives want to add to. Moving forward, there were in the state, 11 states that had gubernatorial elections in 2024. 3 sitting governors sought re-election. And then we had 85 out of 99 state chambers, in the United States held elections in 2024, with the Republicans now controlling more than 55 to 56% of the seats nationally. So the Republican Party feels good, and I don't blame them for feeling that way. It's because at the state level and at the congressional level, but the question now is, you have this power. How is that power going to be utilized? And how is that going to impact small businesses like you as subcontractors in the construction industry? And stay tuned, and we need to find that out. The big issue that I've been asked about, I'm still working on, is how this will impact Davis-Bacon projects moving forward. But I think, and not to get ahead of myself, but I think we'll see a lot of that discussion moving forward in the next term, but also as these disaster assistance packages move forward, how are they going to play out? But we were able to maintain order with the administration the last time, and also too, late last week on the House side, they did introduce legislation dealing with IRAPs, industry recognized apprenticeship programs, at a detriment to us as registered apprenticeship programs. We were not surprised by this. We were prepared for this, but at the end of the day, it is something that we'll have to see. But we were able to fend that off in the last administration, so when Trump was president. So what happens now moving forward, 2026, very exciting. 2 more years from now, we'll be back in the game. But the thing is, it'll flip. And the Republicans will have 21 members up, and then 13 Democrats will as well. I will say that Texas, just as an aside, because people have asked me about Ted Cruz's race, there are always a lot more votes in Republican votes in Texas. But the more you keep wearing down Ted Cruz like they did in this last election, the previous election, it makes it even harder for his counterpart, Senator Cornyn, to run for re-election, because if they can't take Cruz, they'll try to take him. So again, how that all plays out, it's not to say it's still not a strong red state, but how it plays out is yet to be determined. So any comments, questions, concerns before I go any further into the lame duck at 119th Congress just on the election? I'm trying not to make very clear, I'm not trying to offend anyone with these comments. I'm just trying to give you what I know based upon the polling and from what I've read and from what I've heard, where I think things are moving forward. All right, well then, moving forward on the lame duck, where are we at? Lame duck, we got to orient our new members. They're coming into Washington. They're giddy. They're excited. This is a great time. So welcome to Washington. Second is the election of leaders. We talked about that last week with the Senate. We put that in our congressional update. I would say to you right now, I would definitely pay attention to the congressional update, because there are a lot of things that are happening that are relevant to our members. Also, the election of the leaders. So we know in the Senate, we look forward to seeing what I imagine the House is pretty much going to stay the same. Also, too, Nancy Pelosi, is seeking re-election, believe it or not. So even though Hakeem Jeffries will be the minority leader, but her role in asking President Biden to step down has caused a little bit of consternation within the Democratic leadership roles. And so how that plays out, if she does run for re-election and her presence still within the caucus, will be, let's just say the jury's still out how that continues to play. Jockeying of committee roles, unfortunately for us, I think Virginia Fox is still going to stick around in the House Labor and Education and Labor Committee, but we'll see, or Education Workforce Committee, but we'll see how that plays out. She's not necessarily always been a friend to us as union employers, but stay tuned. And then we have to get ready to finish out our work, which we'll get in the next slide of what's still outstanding. We have to go through the president-elect's team. He is moving at a rapid pace, which is not surprising. Actually, he's far ahead of where he was in 2016. And he's far ahead where Barack Obama, George W. Bush was, or President Biden on his nominees for these secretarial positions. However, though, I will tell you, he is circumventing the GSA transition team process. What does that mean? The General Services Administration provides funds and the structure, the platform for the transition team. But he's not using that. He's using actually a third party with outside funds in order to put that transition team together. What that allows him to do is not necessarily, it gives him the freedom to allow his appointees to not necessarily go through criminal background checks, et cetera. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Also, too, you see some of his nominees are going to be controversial. I've already explained about how that's going to impact the filibuster and, recess appointments. So all of that still needs to be considered. Has not landed yet on the labor secretary, looking at his former labor secretary as a possibility. But as I know more, I'll let you know. But that's still, as far as I'm aware, has not been settled. He did put in Chris Wright, who owns a hydraulic fracturing natural gas company in Colorado, as his Department of Energy. Secretary of Energy is obviously going to play a big role. So stay tuned on that. Without unified control, budget reconciliation could be used to circumvent a filibuster. So what does that mean? Budget reconciliation would mean that, if the Republicans vote in on a budget that's far leaner than what the Democrats anticipate, or if they're trying to get something reconciled as in terms of a financial matter, they'll not need Democratic votes. They don't have to do the filibuster on that. It only needs to be a majority vote. So you're going to see a lot of things like that potentially steamroll itself through the Senate. And again, a large part of the Senate calendar, and I write this a lot in the congressional updates, will be, especially in New Year, dealing with judicial nominations and the secretarial nominations to the executive office. So stay tuned there. The bigger issue, and we talked limitedly about this, but the bigger issue, you may have heard about the Chevron case. The Supreme Court decided to change that. That started during the EPA with the Nixon administration. It was allowing for the oil and gas companies to have a final attempt to better understand what Congress's intent was through the technical corrections process, and to allow the agency and those companies have a dialogue to see what truly was Congress's interpretation. That now has been overturned by the Supreme Court because basically the conservative judges decided that there was a lot of slips between the mouth and the cup, for a lack of a better analogy. So they said they have to now go to the courts. Where I think that is a concern for Trump is because that is President-elect Trump, because if he puts his cabinet secretaries in place, he's going to want them to make final decisions. He's not going to look for a court to do that. So I'm not sure exactly how he's going to see the unintended consequences and face the unintended consequences of the Chevron decision, but that's certainly of importance. And how I'll break that down even further for you here on this call, if we have a project in an oil and natural gas facility or refinery, and we're doing the industrial coatings, or if we're working on a project dealing with, say, an environmental impact statement has to be done, say at an airport or at a wastewater treatment facility, and we're waiting on a permit or we're waiting for a study to come through, and we find out that we disagree with the study, rather than working with the agency, now we're going to have to take it to the court. That delays the project, but yet the project has to move forward. So what does that mean for the Army Corps? What does that mean for the, transportation infrastructure projects that are working on? What does that mean for you and the supplies, et cetera, et cetera? So stay tuned to see if they address that, but it's on our radar. Again, Congress meets on January 3rd, which is a Friday this year, so that'll be interesting how that plays out for swearing in, bleeding into the weekend, and then on January 20th is the inauguration. I have had some members ask me about inauguration tickets. I can't make any promises, but if you have any requests for them, please let me know. I'll work with the individual Senate and House offices to see, and the president's transition team to see if whether or not I can get you some tickets. I was successful in that for you 4 years ago and 4 years prior. But again, I don't want to make any guarantees, but if you have any requests for them, please let me know. Moving forward, as I mentioned numerous times, next year, big priority, and Bernie and I have talked about that. And Bernie, your background is going to be even more useful to us than it already is, just in terms of understanding these tax cuts and provisions and what that means to you in succession planning, estate planning, the repeal of the death tax, also the elimination of taxes on overtime, Social Security, etc. Also, the clean energy tax credits from the Democrats' 2022 law, which was the Inflation Reduction Act, which was actually the Build Back Better, enrolling them back, and how are they going to play out? What's the impact on tariffs and trade? As you know, many of us worked on this back in 2011 into 2012, dealing with the anti-dumping rule for curtain walls and aluminum extrusions with the Department of Commerce. How are those tariffs going to be played out? What's that impact to you in your industry? Stay tuned. In healthcare, there's been talk about repealing the Affordable Care Act. What will that look like? We do not know. And then obviously on immigration, dealing with the elimination of DACA, heavy restraint and restrictions for asylums and parole, looking at reenacting HR 2, which is a much more draconian immigration bill, and then looking at what the Senate Judiciary is going to do along with the House when it comes to immigration reform and I-9 audits, and what the impact's going to have on our workforce, and also what's going to happen on immigration for when we call out those 1099 employees. I see this as an opportunity for us, but I also see some unintended consequences that also can impact our marketplace. So stay tuned as we learn more. And then spending debates, obviously they're going to be much more fiscally conservative. So what does that look like? And then on the environmental side, drill, baby, drill, attempt to repeal some of the clean energy spending, and then also dealing with slashing environmental justice groups, as well as eliminating the energy tax credits, which we talked about. And then our legislative priorities will continue to push forward on these in 2025. They're in no particular order, and we're always willing to amend them moving forward. I will put out an announcement this week in this week's congressional update on the overtime rule. The overtime rule was overturned on Friday in the Texas federal court. So the overtime exemption, and as well as the minimum salary requirements that was proposed by President Biden, will not move forward. I repeat, will not move forward. And the question is, they'll revert back to what was already in place. And whether or not Trump decides to take that up, I'm not sure. Also, I imagine they're going to bring up the independent contractor rule like they did the last time. So what does that look like? And as I mentioned before, Davis-Bacon and the impact on us, what does that look like as well? So with that, I just mentioned that, we're getting ready for our upcoming fly, and we're already talking about it, looking to potentially the spring, but if not the spring, in that July timeframe. So stay tuned as I work with both the co-chairs to figure out the best time for you to come in. But it's very, very important. I know we took a hiatus this year for good reason, but we have to be back in next year. This is a critical time for us, not only to meet the new members, but also get in front of the administration. And as I get in front of the administration, I will get you in front of them as well. So with that, I'll pause. And yeah, I got this little cartoon. I thought it was pretty funny. I put it in the congressional update last week, but just to say I'm going to hibernate early. Wake me after the election, the recounts, the legal battles, the certification, swearing in. So, but we're at least, I think this is a little apropos for a couple of years ago. I think we're on the right track this time. But I really, really do hope, and this is a personal opinion, not on behalf of FCA International, but in the personal opinion, we don't have another January 6th. But I'm thinking we won't. But I'm open to any comments, questions, or concerns. So please, thank you.
Great stuff, Mike. Thank you for that. Any questions? Put them in the chat, or any comments from our co-chairs. That'd be fantastic.
Yep.
Yeah, this is Bernie Gingras here in northern New Jersey. Great recap, Mike. I'm certainly glad that the election is over. I'm not even in one of the states that are in play, and I was sick of seeing the ads on TV. watch everything with my mute button. So it's great that it's over, but we're on to the new and bigger things. I see that there's about 26 people on this call. If we walked into an office in Washington, D.C. on a fly-in with 26 people, that would be great. But if 21 of them are association execs, doesn't work.
Right.
We need contractors on these fly-ins to come in and talk to these legislators, because these contractors are their constituents, their employers in their area, and they're the people that really need to be on the forefront. Guys like myself, association execs, Mike, our lobbyists, John, we'll fill in the blanks, we'll take care of the particulars, but we need you people on the line when we go in to talk to somebody.
Great
That's
point,
kind of my
Bernie.
pitch. Besides that, the GRAC itself is an advisory committee to the board of FCA. We don't take any actions on our own. We basically, it's advice and counsel.
Thanks a lot, Bernie. Those are great points.
Yeah, I'll echo Bernie's comments. We're glad the election is over. It went the way a lot of us, or some of us, wanted. The whole complexion now of Washington, D.C. has kind of changed after the election. And Bernie's right. We need to get more contractors involved. That's who they want to talk to, because the contractors have skin in the game. So, yeah, I'd put that out there. See if we can round up some more contractors to support this.
Thanks a lot,
Ken
Ken.
is our contractor co-chair. I think this is the only committee in the FCA that has a co-chair, and that co-chair is a contractor, and he's there for a reason.
If I may add just one comment to that, I recently was invited out by Katie Scott and her IFCA FCA members here, in the region, in the Southeast, in Pennsylvania, Delaware, et cetera. And I am willing to come out to talk to your group if you need someone to kind of highlight the importance and kind of walk through the process, because it's really not that intimidating. We set it up in such a way to make it very user friendly. We've been doing it for years, and it's good to develop that rapport with those offices. And this is a good time to do it now, because you're laying the groundwork in a new Congress, which is every 2 years. But when it came time for important issues, like I mentioned, the curtain wall issue with Department of Commerce, we had allies in the Senate and the House help us. We had allies dealing with us with the multi-employer pension reform. We went to EPA on lead paint regulations years ago with Rick Vandegraff and many others, pushing that issue. So they need to see you. It's important. I can tell you your contemporaries are doing it in other associations and other members of the Construction Employers Association like NECA, the MCA. So we can do it. That would be great. If you can, I get it. But I promise you this, if you do get involved and you do come, it'll be a good use of your time.
Mike, what time frame are we looking at for our fly-in?
Well, right now, like I said, we're still determining, because Easter is a little bit later this year. So perhaps your annual meeting's a little bit earlier in March. So if we don't get it in before Memorial Day, it'll be immediately after, but it will not be after August. So it's going to be sometime between May and August. And we've done it in July in years past for good reason. And if we could possibly get something in maybe sooner than that, we can do that as well. It's usually on a Wednesday. So you come in Tuesday and then you're on the Hill all day Wednesday. For those of you who may or may not be aware of this, but Wednesday is the one day we know they're going to work when they're in session. So it's a good day. They're usually in their offices, and we found it to be very productive. You never want to do a fly-in when they're not in DC, and Wednesday is the one day where they're there, because they're either flying in on Tuesday and out on Thursday. So if you come in Tuesday, we've done some really cool things too, by the way, for those of you who are traveling from across country. We've gone to the FBI building. We've gone to the Library of Congress. We've done the Botanical Gardens. So we do a little fun event. Then we have a little prep session. We always have a nice dinner. Thank you, FCA International. And then the next day it's hit the ground running. And then you can leave Wednesday afternoon. Usually don't get a meeting after 5 o'clock. So, but again, more to follow. And I'll work with Bernie and Ken and you, John, on the best time for the date for the fly-in.
All right. Any closing remarks?
I have none.
Nice job, Mike.
Thank you, everybody.
Good job. It's going to be an interesting year for sure. The more the
Exactly.
merrier.
Yeah, I'll
Yep.
just say thank you for Mike, Bernie, and Ken. Thank you for your continued leadership for our legislative issues. So thank you for all your efforts on that.